Recently, a friend talked to me about her father, who had worked in the sugar beet factory in Mallow, County Cork. He sounded like a particularly good, decent, and inspiring man who reared a large family and did well by them, enabled, of course, by his wife, but also by the solid wages and steady job of working in a state subsidised industry. It was particularly poignant hearing about the last days of her father's employment in the factory before closure in 2006. There had been 4 sugar beet factories founded in the 1920s and 1930s that had grown to become economic stars of the new Irish state, providing hundreds of well-paid jobs in the provinces and livings to thousands of rural families throughout the country. The railway network also was a major beneficiary from the transport of sugar beet to the factories. But after joining the EEC in the 1970s, the economic justifications for a continuing native sugar beet industry eroded away. Some said we were sabotaged, and eventually all the factories closed. Substantial compensation was paid to workers and farmers at the time, but again, many felt they'd been sold down the river. I have my own memories of sugar beet. Born in 1946, I grew up on a farm in Tipperary, and my father had a beet growing contract with the Thurles factory. And giving us a front seat view of a dynamic part in the whole industry, a spur line of the Great Southern Railway from Thurles to Clonmel ran within 100 yards of our farmhouse. From October to February, trains transported their 20-ton open box wagons full of sugar beet day and night northwards to the factory. Some of my earliest memories would have been of the rumblings and puffings, steam engines of course then, of the long beet trains running throughout the night. Initially, I would have been frightened. We were new to the farm from 1952, but in a while I no longer imagined dragons and grew to be comfortable with the trains. Beet was big in our lives then, and I remember much of the activities of growing and harvesting the crop. Someday I will, maybe, write a comprehensive memoir of the whole experience. In the meantime, I've written up 2 episodes, part chapters maybe. One only deals peripherally with the harvesting of the beet. It's much more to do with my dad's character. It's called A Loose Cannon. The other explores the pain of thinning beet by hand and a teenager's obsession. I wrote up the latter, which I call The Contract, for a competition a while back. I present this now as narration, a podcast. The Contract. The sun beat down hard that June day in 1958. Ireland was reeling in untypical, hot, dry weather. We'd had it for weeks and there was no sign of it ending. It was a boon to most, a curse to a few, but mostly welcomed by farmers. Grass growth may have slowed, but good, well-saved hay, then almost the only source of winter fodder, could be made in a couple of days. This year it would have more feeding in it, easing the winter for the cattle and horses. The whole countryside was busy at haymaking. To country children beginning the school holidays, the good weather spelled heaven. Old enough to be let loose, and too young for the heavier farm work, the kids roamed free and wild over the fields with their dogs and plans for mischief. The cold, spring-fed local river refreshed when the going got too hot. Adults took little part, trusting, mostly justified, that nature would safely look after their offspring. Hunger and tiredness and the need for motherly succour would entice and gather them all home eventually. My father and some men, neighbours and a few paid day labourers were working at hay in the meadow part of our big field. The other part was in tillage. I was 11 years old, and I would normally have been with the men on the small grey Ferguson tractor, innocently and unknowingly, of course, ushering in the modern age. "He's as good as half a dozen men at the hay," my father boasted of my precocious skills. But the Fergie was out of action, half dismantled in a shed with a suspected dropped piston. It awaited a rainy day for attention. The older, slower methods of haymaking, not yet forgotten, were easily reverted to. With little demand on me, I should have been off gallivanting with my sisters and friends. But I had something else on my mind. I was obsessed. I'd fallen in love with a gun. The gun was an air rifle. It was on display in the window of our local hardware shop. Everything about the gun was seductive, including the brand name Diana. Checking in my mother's Pear's encyclopedia, I found Diana was the goddess of the hunt. What more did I need to justify my idolatry? She was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Everything that preceded the goddess, mechano sets, ship and plane models, hurling, reading, the tractor, to me just a great toy, now paled in comparison. Diana had taken over. She'd been in the shop for weeks. I never went by without stopping to look. The barrel and other metalwork of the gun was blued. "Only on the best guns," the shopman told me later, and the walnut stock gleamed. I imagined snuggling my cheek against that satiny wood, pulling it firmly into my shoulder as I gently squeezed the trigger. The smell of the wood oil and gun grease was in my nostrils, through the glass. I was too shy to go in and ask to inspect the gun closer, to feel the heft of it, as my father would say of a new hay fork. Then, last week, a man came out of the shop. "Why don't you come in and have a closer look?" he invited. As I hesitated, readying to bolt, he cajoled me. Come on in. I won't bite you. It won't bite you." So I went in. He put her in my hands. He was an astute man, probably the owner. He knew his mark. Reading the signs, he'd probably made a guess that of all the window shoppers, I might be the one that could afford the gun, or move mountains to own it. "I'll keep it for you if you put £1 down on it, he said. I had £1. Tips for the tractor work had been good, so impulsively I gave him £1. But, being the budding farmer, never give a man his asking price, insisted on half a crown back. But there was no point. The price, £8, 19 shillings and sixpence, 3 times the labourer's weekly wage, was way beyond my reach. It would be a mountain to climb to get that much money together. On top of which, I was completely ignoring a crucial fact. My father, despite teaching me early to shoot with rifle and shotgun, he had a 12-bore Winchester pump-action shotgun. Same as Ernest Hemingway's favourite gun, he used to brag, would not agree to let me have a gun of my own. It was okay to shoot crows and pigeons with him. They were always a threat to ripening grain crops. But he'd already laid it down firmly. I was still too young to own a gun. Hardly out the door of the shop, I was panicking, defying my dad. He'd kill me. Carried away emotionally, I'd acted hastily, stupidly. I couldn't go against him, and even if I did, trying to earn that kind of money quickly would leave too wide a trail. I could certainly say goodbye to my 17 shillings and sixpence. I thought of all I might have purchased: bars of Cadbury's hazelnut chocolate, half a dozen bottles of my favourite soft drink, a few comics, and maybe a couple of nights at the pictures in the local cinema. A lot for a budding sybarite to give up. Shit. In desperation, and ignoring the permission obstacle, logic was a frustration. I tried to work out a plan. There was a way of getting the bulk of the money: thinning beet, sugar beet. Almost every arable farm in Ireland had beet then, a legacy from the compulsory tillage orders of the war years. The beet was transported to factory refineries that produced most of our sugar. We had a contract with the factory for 4 acres, a respectable sized crop in those labour-intensive days. There was a scarcity of thinners. There was always a shortage of thinners. It was back-breaking work, and adult farm labourers absolutely shunned it. Because of the hot weather that year, they particularly found always something more pressing to do. Although workers were paid well for the piece rate work, it was one activity where the metal didn't apply. There were few coming forward. Often the farmer had to pay migrant workers way over the top to get the beet thinned. It was the obvious let-out for me, but I shuddered at the thought. Previously, I had suffered septic fingers and skinned knees from doing a relatively modest amount of it. The garden here, with its intimidating long drills, and in this unrelenting hot weather, was an extra daunting prospect. Nevertheless, possible, maybe. The money side of the equation could be solved. That just left the permission question. I was surely snookered. Although no license was required then for an airgun, I just couldn't go down the road of going against my father's wishes. It was only 6 months since he'd made it quite clear it was an absolute no-no. After agonising for some days, I finally decided to come clean with Dad. Maybe by some miracle he'd had a change of heart about allowing me to have a gun. Perhaps I'd impressed him with my maturity, although I couldn't think how. His reaction was a total surprise. Calmly, almost smiling, he said, "I am glad you've come to me with this, Jimmy. I'll give it a bit of thought. We'll talk again in the morning." I guess he saw challenges and opportunities in the situation. He spoke to me at breakfast. "Jimmy, as you know, we're in some difficulty with the thinning. It's a worry. It's just not getting done, and I need to break the back of it. So, I'll tell you what I'll do with you." I was too innocent then to suspect my father of cunning, but I do think he was exploiting my obvious passion. Later, I also thought that he had probably mollified my mother's fears by telling her that he would be setting me an almost impossible task, and thus, likely, there would not have to be a gun. Thin an acre of the beet within a week, the next week, beginning tomorrow, and you'll have your gun. But you must do the acre in the week. If you fall short in the time, no gun. But you won't lose out. I'll give it the full rate anyway for the completed drills. Dad spelt it out even more. I'd secured the gun for the time being with my deposit of 17 shillings and sixpence. If the thinning was completed, he'd go with me to the shop. He'd bargain with the shopkeeper over the £8 2 shillings and sixpence balance and get it reduced probably to £7 and 10 shillings. There was little doubt about that. Hard dealing was a farmer's pride. The wheels were in motion. It could be done. I was elated. Sure, but also tense. The finer details of the deal were: the drills are 300 yards long. It wasn't called a big field for nothing. Therefore, there are 24 drills to the acre. The full calculation: 4,840 square yards divided by 300 linear yards equals 16 linear yards on the headland, or 48 feet. The drills are 24 inches or 2 feet wide, giving 24 drills to the acre. At 5 shillings per drill, that would amount to £6. Assuming my father drove his bargain well at the shop, I would be getting a bonus of £1 and 10 shillings on top of the £6, the price of the gun. Forgive me for the maths. We did these kinds of calculations all the time. In the course of doing contracting work for the farmers, I was getting as good as my father at it. Dad might have been taking advantage, but so was I. Diana was the more powerful .22 caliber type. It would kill a rabbit at medium range. The standard gun was just .177 caliber, probably just about enough to kill a rat at that distance. The more powerful gun might have put Dad off, so I concealed this from him. I felt guilty about that. I also didn't tell him that Diana could fire a type of sulphur-coated slug that banged and sparked when hitting a hard surface, just as in our beloved westerns. But sure, in my way of reasoning at the time, a little deception didn't matter. I was going to be so careful with the gun. A paragon of safety. I was mature. I could be trusted. All this negotiation felt very adultish. A contract was being made. But nothing was written down. No need to, for my father was a man of his word. He never let us down. He was a rock. So, the labours began. I went thinning. Let me describe the what and the why of the job. Sugar beet was important then, its cultivation and manuring invaluable in natural weed control and crop rotation. And above all, when little else was paying in the winter, the checks from the factory were very welcome in the last weeks of December. Our sugar plum fairy. Without beet, there might be a fairly poor Christmas. And without thinning, there was no crop. And it had to be done by hand. There was no other way. Before precision sowing came in, beet seed was sown thickly along the centre of drills. Within a month or so, the beet had grown to about 3 inches, and the drills were green mats of upcoming weeds. This was cut away with a horse-drawn disc cultivator, leaving a continuous stand of sugar beet plants. The row was then hoed or gapped, leaving a clump of entwined plants every 6 inches or so. It was the thinner's job to thin or single that clump, leaving the best candidates standing. It sounds easy, and it would be for anyone for a half hour or so, but thinning on your knees for hour after hour, day after day, in the beating sun. Our long drills had over 1,800 clumps per drill. 2 drills would be a fair day's work. A very fair day's work in this sun, and with the ground so hard baked. Speed and dexterity were necessary, and above all, a Spartan toughness. If you were slow, you would be totally demoralised. If you were constantly looking up towards the headland, you mightn't get through even 1 drill in a day. And there was no payment for partially completed drills. Although Dad was a bit soft and wouldn't leave anyone depart without a bob or 2. The rectangular big field was bowl-shaped, a natural amphitheatre. Surrounded on 2 sides by public roads, it was dished gently in the middle. At 25 acres, it was our biggest field and had the best soil of the whole farm. Surrounded on 2 sides by roads, any passer-by could see what was going on. We have to do everything right. The neighbours are watching, was my father's constant, if insincere, mantra. He was probably less interested in what the neighbours might say than in just keeping everybody on their toes. Half the field was ploughed, and wheat and root crops, including the sugar beet, had been sown there. A week before, my nemesis stretched ahead of me, 24 dead straight, 300-yard long drills. Crouched, creeping along on my knees between drills, I must have looked tiny, puny against its size. Of the 120,000 square yards of the field, my presence hardly took up a square yard, a flea on an elephant's rump. To someone watching, I would seem to dissolve into the shimmering ground mirages as I crawled snail-paced down the drills. I steeled myself to never stop, never to look up. I saved peeing, drinking water, or eating a sandwich for the headlands every 3 hours, give or take. In the hayfield opposite, my father, the old fella, or Stevie to his face, and the workers sweated at their tasks. Forking the crisp dry grass into heaps, gatherings, they wielded their 2-tine hay forks with age-old craft, pulling, sifting, and shaping the hay into tall, rounded cocks or trams. I didn't realise until later, when I worked closely with one of the labourers from that time, how much the centre of a drama I was at that time. I was being closely observed by my father and the men, particularly in the last few hours of my task. I started out at 7 a.m. on the first day and finished 4 drills. I was suffering already, but I was grimly satisfied. I had to aim at 4 a day, at 1,200 yards. It was lonely work. I hadn't thought of that. Not for me, in my job, the comfort of companionship, the chatter that enlivened and shortened the labourer's day. Obsession was my concert. By starting even earlier in the morning and finishing later with a big break in the middle of the day for a swim, by the end of the 5th day I had only 4 drills to go. My triumph loomed. My mother wanted me to stop. My fingers were in a bad way. Some nails were split and falling off. The tips of some of my fingers were raw and almost unbearably sore. Mam, bringing tea and sandwiches to us all, massaged Vaseline into my hands. Generous daubs of the cure-all Nivea cooled the sunburn on my face and neck. It was tempting always to stop. Who, least of all a child, enjoys pain day after day after day? But now, after a huge effort, I was ahead of my quota. Quitting could not be an option now. So, the next day, the 6th day, I gave myself a half day, doing just 2 drills, one early, the other late, up to dusk. I was pacing myself for the final push. The river and the company of peers in the long afternoon revived me, but I was shocked at how challenging it was to come back to the garden in the evening, alone, even for just 1 drill. Like a marathon, this was my wall. I cried a bit, but I got through it. I was stoically switched off to pain and failure. I had no doubt that I would finish. I started at dawn that day. The idea was to finish the last 2 drills before midday and arrange to collect my prize. Oblivious to the pain, I finished the last yards head down in a flurry. I half expected a welcoming party, but there was just one figure on the headland. My father. And he was behaving strangely. I'd never seen that expression on his face before. Conflicted would be the best word for it. There were tears in his eyes. He tried to hug me. I shrugged him off. I was confused. This was far from being a celebration. I should be a hero. What's up? Can we go down to town now and collect the gun? I croaked out dismally, knowing in my very bones that something was wrong. You can't have the gun, he said, with a tremor in his voice. Jimmy, I'm so sorry. Packy Ryan was telling me there was a terrible accident with an air rifle recently, and a child lost an eye. There was murder over it, and the father was blamed for letting his son have the gun. I'm so sorry to be going back on my word. I know, but I've talked to your mother and we're both agreed. It's the lesser of 2 evils. I'll make it up to you, Jimmy. In other words, I promise. I was stunned. I couldn't say anything. I didn't have the vocabulary to attack him cogently. But I suppose I didn't need to. My reaction, as it was having the desired result, making him suffer. I felt totally betrayed. Tears ran down my face, and I guess I was looking at the dear man with total disgust. You gave your word, I gritted viciously through my teeth. The men, I later heard, held court. Was the old fellow right? Or did the youngster deserve to get the gun and hang the consequences? Losing an eye is a terrible thing, and whatever went through the brain? He's a sensible youngster. He'd be careful with the gun. None of us would be safe. There'd be pellets flying all over the place. If a man hasn't his word, he has nothing. I went to the river, our swimming place. I did my underwater thing, my speciality, repeatedly almost bursting my lungs, but it was a way to hide rage, disappointment and tears. I got paid, probably generously overpaid. I don't remember. I didn't care. I was beyond consolation. Later, he bought me a fishing rod. It was a handsome split cane rod with a box of flies and spools of line. I went through the motions of learning dry fly fishing, but never caught a trout with it. My heart wasn't in it. I stopped kissing my father good night. That hurt him. Later that year, I secretly swapped the fishing gear for a .22 Gesado air rifle, about 50% more powerful than the Diana. I had to fork out £3 10 shillings as well. I'd have given more. But as with the fishing rod, I never quite bonded with it either. Target practice and shooting vermin, the latter too much of a favour to my dad anyway, became tedious after a few months. To spice things up, I had a partner in crime by then, resorted to Jules, my friend, D, to allow him some anonymity in his retirement, shot me with his older brother's .177 caliber gun, ironically a Diana. We were stalking one another, with rules, of course. One of the rules was that you aimed below the belt, backside preferably. He got the drop on me, but not being as good a shot as I, he hit me in the face, in the centre of my right cheek, to be precise. The subsequent operation was carried out in his mother's kitchen. I directed him using a knitting needle probe, sterilised, of course, with a hand mirror. The pellet had not gone completely through, but with the blood, the swelling, and my friend's shaking fingers, we couldn't find it. We called off the procedure, assuming the pellet had fallen out. It hadn't, and it showed up alarmingly, but also amusingly, in an MRI scan 50 years later. My mother, used to seeing me regularly coming home singed or wounded, readily accepted my explanation. I ran into the back of the hay turner. Farms were dangerous places. The positive side of the jewel was that D hadn't been using my rifle. If he had, and he often did, the kitchen surgery would not have been sufficient. Doctor's clinic, at least. Hospital? We'd have been found out, and the guns confiscated. And, of course, my father would have been completely vindicated. Short of death in my adolescent universe, that couldn't be allowed to happen. Later, I fell in love with horses and sold the gun. Later still, I fell in love with a girl who loved horses. The memory of the betrayal slowly faded. Over half a lifespan, there were many ups and downs with my father, but in his last years we had an opportunity to forgive and reconcile about important things, with few words, but with hugs and tears. I had my own son by then, and a slight suspicion that my later relations with him might not follow an untroubled trajectory, no more than it did with myself and my dear dad. In this business of life, we need a little luck. And apart from a small blip, I've had it in abundance with my son. I have a gun today, all properly legal. It's a 12-bore Remington Magnum pump-action shotgun, like my dad's. I've never shot anything with it, not even clay pigeons. Not even fired when a neighbour shot at me. Sure, it's a near sensual thing, a fetish. I like its heft, the polished walnut stock, its clacking, smooth action, its explosive potential. Two wonderful smells permeate my younger years. Incense at Tridentine High Mass and the smell of cordite after firing a cartridge. I know, shades of Robert Duvall on a beach in Vietnam. Girls have gone. Women, including a wife, have gone. Friends have come and mostly gone too. And although the Remington is seldom given an airing now, and is probably very non-politically correct to say so, it is a comfort to simply know it's there. I guess I'll have to give it up when they cart me off to the nursing home. But in the meantime, Shinna will.